Thanks very much indeed. I want to say first that I'm extremely grateful to this prestigious Pontifical Academy for inviting me to participate in this conference, because the theme, human rights and the pandemic, is at the heart of the future of our societies, but also of humanity. We must indeed, I think, get used to the fact that in the age of globalization, viruses circulate and can endanger entire populations at the speed of light. And it was almost the case with regard to the COVID-19. I already addressed this issue 30 years ago when I was president of the International Committee of Bioethics of UNESCO, and also the president of the Bioethics Committee of the European Union. And above all, I was made aware of this ethical dimension of the right to health when in 1991, I submitted a report on bioethics called On the Frontier of Life to the French Prime Minister. The aim was to make legislative proposals in order to set limits to the advances of biology and medicine, so as to prevent scientific progress from turning against the human person. What strikes me today, I must say, is the extent to which the issue of relationship between human rights and health have dramatically changed. The aim of bioethics, as you perfectly well know, because the Pontifical Academy was very much involved in this reflection, is to protect the human person, the individual, in his dignity, that is to say, his physical and mental integrity. In other words, it is a question of preserving the freedom of each individual to make the medical choices that concern him or her, against, well, remembrance of Nazi experiment especially. The aim of health management in the event of a pandemic is different. It is to protect entire population from the risks of contamination. And to do this, in my view, it is no longer principally individual freedom that must prevail, but solidarity. And it's from this reflection that I would like to evoke 3 points. First of all, the differences in approach between medical bioethics on the one hand and the public management of a pandemic such as the COVID-19 on the other hand. Second, I'd like to evoke the resistance observed in our rich countries, rich societies in front of sanitary measures, which are felt less protective, but essentially as infringing freedoms. And third, I want to know what you think and to draw some lessons from this paradoxical situation, which reflects, in my view, a very deep moral crisis of our democracies. Now, very serious one. So what about the differences between the reflection and the conception of biomedical ethics versus public health? Biomedical ethics was born from an awareness of the self-destructive power of man in view of the irreversibility of genetic manipulation and genetic engineering. Now, the fear of a near end of humanity is also a springboard for the fight against global warming. But in my view, it was, and perhaps is, excessive. After 30 years, one must admit that genetic has not destroyed man. On the contrary, with regard to COVID-19, it allowed to find the ARN messenger vaccines against this virus. And it's rather a protective tool. Nevertheless, I admit that bioethics law were absolutely necessary to set limits, not to the progress itself, but to its uses, which are possibly very dangerous. And that is why the principal basis of bioethics, of medical, biomedical ethics is informed consent. The autonomy of the individual to choose to accept or not experiments or medical treatments to which he or she is subjected. And the dignity of the human person is that thus confused with its autonomy as a human being, as sharing this common freedom of all human beings on earth. With the pandemic, it's an entirely new paradigm. It's a question of managing populations. And the fundamental principle, in my view, is beneficence. That is to say that each individual should be able to strive not to harm others, to not harm others, which is the basis principle, in my view, of the management of the pandemic. Unfortunately, especially with the social networks, people are not sufficiently educated or aware of what to think, which means that health management, public health, can give place to imposing measures to prevent some people from contaminating others. That is to say, informed consent on the one hand, solidarity, and even imposition of more or less authoritarian measures on the other hand. And this is a big question nowadays, because for the first time in my generation, years ago, decades ago, vaccines were considered as, you know, a blessing. Especially I'm of the generation of young people having had polio, some friends of mine and in my family. But now vaccines is for some persons an infringement of their freedom, which is entirely new. And that is to say that we see in our rich societies political or social groups calling for civil disobedience. And the action is the more astonishing that it doesn't come only from activist or anarchist movements, but also from traditionalist movements, which we were used to see on the side of law and order. And well, in our rich society, what do we see? We see demonstration regularly against the health pass, against distancing measures, against vaccination. Judges, for the first time, are overwhelmed by the influx of appeals against government. In France, we have a former Minister of Health who is sued before the highest court of the land for having badly managed, so in other words, killed people because she was supposedly not active enough. So there is this hatred against the people who are in charge in our democracy, well, to govern. And this is really something which is quite worrying. And I'd like to share with you the lesson that we can learn from this situation in our rich countries. Because the pandemic is for me an eye-opener. It reveals societies that are increasingly fragmented, and solidarity has given place to individualism. And in the past, democracies were attacked from outside, and the wars were the main dangers. Now, the enemies are ourselves. And it is from the inside that democracies, that is to say, the way to live together with all our differences, are endangered. And as I said, it's not the place to discuss about that here. Social networks have a large responsibility, but it's another question. So civil disobedience, from my viewpoint, is certainly a courageous attitude in dictatorships, but in democracies, it is really deadly. And that's why I would like to, if you allow me, to propose a few avenues to conclude. First of all, the institutional framework of democracies have to be rethinked, and citizens should be made actors of their own fate and accept also the rule of majority, having been able to express their views. So it's not yet something which we know and we don't know how to do, but I think it's really because people can express themselves and have a direct dialogue with the president of the republic or the chief of the government in a country, and they feel that they are not participating, which is paradoxical, but we have to think of what is a democracy in the 21st century. The second part, I think we have to give priority to education, and education to understand the others, education to mercy, education not to hatred, which is so widespread now in our societies, but education to beneficence. And of course, it means that we accept the difference of others. And the church has a role to play because of its universalism, because we have in our Western society considered that universalism was the solution. But in fact, it doesn't work. And the people are not convinced that it is a solution. So education is the first and foremost priority of all democracies, in cooperation with others, with religions, with groups, with other countries. And of course, I'm very pro-European, as you know, as a former Minister for Europe. And I think that Europe has a role to play, which it doesn't play really. The third point is to make of public health a global clause. That is to say that there is not the rich countries having access to all healthcare means and the poor countries having no access. It's a global cause. I'm not sure that WTO has this mission. I think that we are to think of how to motivate the international community together. It's a social and economic cause. And finally, I'm a bit shocked to see that we speak of poor countries and rich countries. What we see is that in poor countries, the leaders are not poor. They are extremely rich, and some of them are extremely corrupt, not only in poor countries, but also in rich countries. But it is more outrageous, I think, in poor countries. I mean that public health is a cause that cannot be defended if we don't fight against corruption that corrodes societies, so that the leaders and their friends in the countries where they exist are no longer able to enrich themselves at the expense of their people and rob them of their right to life, to health, and to prosperity. Thank you.